Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Moulthrop. I'm Chief Executive here, also a proud member. And it's my pleasure to introduce our forum today, a conversation with Vice Admiral Forrest Faison III, the U.S. Navy Surgeon General, and Dr. Toby Cosgrove, veteran himself and former President and CEO of Cleveland Clinic. Cleveland, as you've heard, is just one of 14 cities hosting Navy Week activities this year, providing Clevelanders with the opportunity to learn about the Navy and see firsthand what sailors do, while also creating a dialogue between that military branch and local residents. And we're really pleased that the City Club has an opportunity to be a part of that dialogue today. And also, we're pleased to have these two distinguished gentlemen on stage to share their perspectives on the role of war in accelerating advances in medical innovation. Military physicians have played a role in most medical breakthroughs, everything from treatments for infection and infectious disease, revolutions in trauma care, and innovations in telemedicine and prosthetic technology. And while these advancements may have originated on the battlefield in the treatment of injured soldiers, the benefits have served all of humanity. And at the same time, these advances keep the United States military at full physical force, allowing it to continue to engage in long-standing conflicts that are often more deadly for civilians than for troops. Soldiers can now physically survive severe injuries, and this also takes a toll on their emotional and physical health. And there's been a noticeable increase in post-traumatic stress disorders. These are all things that we'll get into as we think about what the world of healthcare has learned or improved because of the experiences of our military, either on or off the battlefield. It's a good thing we have both of these doctors here with us today, so I'll just say doctor, and both jump in. Vice Admiral Forrest Faison became the 38th Surgeon General of the Navy on December 15th, 2015. He's a former Rocky River resident. He studied at Wake Forest University and the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. As Surgeon General, he oversees the health care of some 850,000 lives of service members and civilians. Dr. Toby Cosgrove is the former CEO and president of the Cleveland Clinic. He served at the clinic from 2004 through 2017, leading the $8 billion organization to new heights of achievement and efficiency, including seeing it ranked the #2 hospital in America, according to the U.S. News and World Report. He currently continues at the clinic as an executive advisor and has a number of other projects, and he may share some of them later on. We'll see if we can get him to talk about Google, perhaps. Before we get started, I want to thank Lieutenant Matt Previtz for his help in making this event happen today. He's the connector that put all of these different pieces together. I also know we have a number of active service members, reservists, and veterans with us today. I want to thank all of you for everything you do and have done for our nation. And speaking of veterans, I did want to start out by recognizing the passing of Senator John McCain, Navy pilot. There was a statement that that his family released that particularly resonated with what we do here at the City Club, and I just thought I would share that. He said, the statement read, "We weaken our greatness when we confuse our patriotism with tribal rivalries that have sown resentment and hatred and violence in all the corners of the globe. We weaken it when we hide behind walls rather than tear them down." So, Toby, you had a chance to meet Senator McCain.
I did. I introduced him when he was running for president, and he spoke at the Cleveland Clinic, and I had an opportunity to then dive deep into his naval experience, and he was incredibly impressive hero for what he did. I thought perhaps the most important thing that he did during that time was that his father and grandfather were both admirals, and when the North Vietnamese found out about this, they offered to release him, and he refused to be released from prison until all of his fellow prisoners were also released, and so he stayed till the end.
An honorable man. Mr. Admiral, did you ever meet John McCain?
I did. I had the privilege of testifying in front of him on the Hill several times, and I will tell you, he is an amazing American patriot, big supporter of our military. The welfare of our service members and their families is at the heart of all he goes after, and and champions and advocates, and he'll be missed.
Indeed. So let's dive into the topic at hand. Admiral, what is it about military conflict that you think really contributes to healthcare innovation?
You know, there's a very famous statement that really the only victor of war is medicine. And that's true, because in war, the mother of invention is necessity. And necessity on the battlefield is saving lives. And so if you look at conflicts over the years, all the inventions, all the innovations, all the advances have been geared with that end state in mind. Save as many lives as you can. You know, the folks who volunteer to serve and sacrifice our country represent less than 1% of our population. And we make a commitment to them when they raise their hand and volunteer and go forward to defend us, that we'll provide them the best care our nation can offer and do all in our power to return them home safely, whether that's on day one of the conflict or the last day of the conflict or after the conflict. We owe them a debt of gratitude, and we make good on that by innovating and doing all we can on the battlefield.
Dr. Cosgrove, the Cleveland Clinic's foundational stories, the founding of the clinic itself, comes out of battlefield medicine.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's led by Dr. Kreil, one of three of the founders of the four Cleveland Clinic founders fought together in France. And what they came away with, they thought that they could do better working together, medical doctors and surgeons, than they could having independent practices. So they came back and formed the Cleveland Clinic. And it's interesting that the mantra was to act as a unit. Subsequently, that led to the whole structure of the Cleveland Clinic. Interesting, there's some other things that have come out of experience, particularly when I came here originally, I was surprised to find that so much of the surgical care was done by former medics from Vietnam. They took the veins from the legs, they sewed up, and they brought tremendous stability to the cardiac surgical process. And that has continued on and been adopted by cardiac surgical programs all over the country. And the second thing that we have done is we picked up on exactly what I witnessed in Vietnam, where helicopters picked up somebody in the field and as dust off, moved them to a small tent hospital where the bleeding was stopped and the wounds were splinted. Then they were moved from there to a hospital in Da Nang or Saigon or someplace. And then they were evacuated back to the Philippines and back to the United States. And as a result, we started an Air Force the same way with ambulances, helicopters, and fixed-wing aircraft that move about 28,000 people get hospital transfers as a result of that.
Admiral, when you and I were speaking prior to this, you had shared with me that from battlefield to care is 15 minutes. Is that the average time now?
What we did in Afghanistan is building on what we learned in Vietnam, took damage control surgery and actually pushed it into the battle space. So that from time of injury until the time that casualty was on the care of a surgeon was never greater than an hour, and actually towards the end of the conflict was 15 minutes, what we call the platinum 15 minutes. And that, plus the advances...
That's a reference to the golden hour?
To the golden hour,
okay.
Exactly. And that plus putting these advances with fibrin bandages and blood substitutes and things like that in the hands of corpsmen to allow treatment to begin right at the time of injury allowed us to build on really the highest combat survival we've ever seen. If you had a survivable injury in Afghanistan, you had a 97% chance of survival because of the things that we learned.
And put that in perspective, during Vietnam, or during the Civil War, 90% of anybody who was injured died. Mm-hmm. In Vietnam, 90% survived, and now 97% are surviving. Incredible change.
What does that mean for civilian trauma care?
Well, this has brought the whole business of resuscitation, ambulances, moving people to get to the proper care at the right time, use of plasma and blood availability, using O-type blood for transfusion. So all of these things were built up over time to begin to, as you say, shorten the period of time, to begin to bring the care quicker and to resuscitate so many of the problems that are related to bleeding.
How long does it take in the city of Cleveland, roughly? I'm not expecting you to know exactly what the data is, but are we at 15 minutes between injury or phone call to an ambulance and being at a hospital?
No,
No.
no. I can't tell you that, but it's not 15 minutes. You'd have to be shot just outside an emergency room to have that happen that fast.
Right, yeah. But nevertheless, though, all of these kinds of innovations have changed the way that your surgeons are delivering trauma care in your emergency department.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the other things that you have to realize is that surgeons particularly are given a tremendous amount of experience in a very compressed period of time.
When they're in the military, during wartime.
At a very young age. Mm-hmm. I mean, I ran a 100-bed facility at age 28, which was an incredible opportunity early on. And the surgeons were just, were just operating day and night on things that were very taxing. And so you grow up really fast. And I think those things translate back. And I think it also goes the other way, that, for example, you think about Rich's coming together with his whole recording the number of injuries, vascular injuries there were in Vietnam. Well, while he was recording those, that moved on into Afghanistan. But also at that same time, the civilians were learning how to treat vascular injuries, and that vascular injuries were brought to the battlefield. Mm-hmm. That experience from the civilians. So it goes both ways, and it's very complementary.
Your microphone has disappeared entirely, Toby, so I'm going to ask you to reattach that if you have a minute. But
either that or I get left off.
Well, then it'll just be myself and the Admiral speaking. So, and you'll just be watching. It'll be like a tennis match for you, just back and forth.
US Open.
Like the U.S. Open, we can just connect this to everything. So, Admiral, right now, or over these 4 years that you're serving, and you've got you're in your final year. Is that right? Next year is your final year of being Surgeon General. But over these 4 years, what kind of innovations have you seen that early in your career you never even would have imagined?
I think the thing that's been most gratifying to see is what we've talked about, taking damage control surgery and resuscitation capability, building that and pushing it forward. And I think we're building on that for the next conflict. We came out of Afghanistan with this very high combat survival, but it was a ground war where we had air superiority, air medical evacuation on demand, really seamless communication.
And it's not over.
Right, seamless communication from point of injury all the way back to the United States. The amazing work of a joint team, the Army casualty care at launch tool by the Army, air medical evacuation by the Air Force, casualty care in the United States by the Navy. It was a joint team moving forward. As we look at the next conflict, which will very likely be for us at sea, as we return to the era of competition between great powers, that will be a very different conflict for us. And so we will not have likely the advantages that we had in Afghanistan of air superiority, air medical evacuation on demand. So we have built upon these technologies and these innovations that we've learned to try and push more into the hands of these corpsmen to be able to not only do casualty resuscitation, but casualty sustainment going forward. So fibrin bandages, again, blood substitutes, amazing advances in digitization and miniaturization allows us to put more capability on board ships and with Marine units than we could ever do before. And that will improve combat survival, not only ashore, but at sea.
You said something really interesting that is not like exactly what we're talking about here, but you said our next conflict will likely be at sea because entering a new sort of era of great powers. Is that the conventional wisdom, that's the intelligence that is circulating right now, that's the predictions or the kind of the bet you guys are making?
Well, if you look at kind of history, the last time that we faced a potential adversary who had the ability to project sea power was World War II. Mm-hmm. Since that time, we've really not had adversaries that had the ability to project credible sea power. As we return now to what our Chief of Naval Operations terms the era of competition between great powers, there are potential adversaries that have the ability to project sea power,
China.
among others.
Uh-huh.
And so those folks now can challenge us on the seas. That means our next conflict could very likely be at sea, or an opposed landing by the Marine Corps by a credible force that can repel them. And so even more critical than ever before is to take those life-saving technologies and those innovations and push them forward to individual ships or to individual Marine units, because we may not be able to evacuate casualties right away. So casualty survival will depend not only on the resuscitation that we talked about, but also our ability to sustain those casualties for perhaps an extended period until we can evacuate them.
The thing that prevents a lot of conflicts is diplomacy.
Absolutely.
And both of you are, although this doesn't fall in your job description, you're both involved in a lot of diplomacy in the way in which healthcare is an export. And Toby, you have overseen the expansion of the Cleveland Clinic beyond U.S. borders, and Admiral, you supervise the delivery of disaster relief as well as healthcare services in places where there aren't disasters. I'd love to hear you both talk about kind of why that matters, why that's part of the mission. Toby.
Well, one of the things that I recognized early on in Vietnam was that, you know, everybody would accept you if you were bringing healthcare. And we've seen that across the world, and that is probably one of the great diplomatic tools that the United States has to offer. And I have talked on multiple occasions with the State Department about this, and they absolutely agree and are anxious to have more and more of that happen with U.S. physicians, U.S. healthcare organizations outside of the United States. And it really is one of those tools that is apolitical and a great opportunity for the United States to spread its message and its goodwill.
Vice Admiral, do you see that in your work?
Absolutely. You know, nobody desires peace more than men and women in uniform. And we find that medical is a tool of diplomacy, where we can go and build strategic partnerships and alliances in ways that others can't, because nobody argues with taking care of sick people. And so we go in there and partner with partner nations in areas of strategic importance to our country to build alliances, improve healthcare, deliver healthcare, and really we're building partnerships that are contributing to peace and stability in regions that are of interest to us.
Can you talk about where you're doing that right now?
Absolutely. So we maintain 2 hospital ships, 2,000-bed floating medical centers, the Comfort and the Mercy, one on each coast. The Mercy just got back from a 6-month...
How big is that? Like 2,000 beds? Like what is that?
It's a converted oil tanker. It's about 1,000 feet long, and it's got 1,000 beds in it.
Wow.
And plus all the major things that you would see in a major medical center. So all the imaging technology, an enormous blood bank, 24 operating rooms, a 48-bed ICU, and 1,000 beds total. And and we have 2 of those. The one on the West Coast just returned from a 6-month deployment where we visited Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Cambodia, Vietnam, East Timor-Leste, to build strategic alliances and partnerships, but also to rehearse disaster relief. 70% of the world's natural disasters occur in the Pacific. Stability in the Pacific is vital to our national interest, peace, prosperity, and our economy. And because of that, we partner, and when we go out there, we do disaster response rehearsals with Australia, New Zealand, the Chinese, Japanese, and other strategic partners in the area, so that if there is a disaster, a tsunami or an earthquake, we can respond, save lives. Because an earthquake or a natural disaster can be just as disruptive as a war. And medical has play in both of those.
Do you find that partnering with other nation states is particularly difficult, or?
Actually, medicine is a universal language.
Right.
And we find it a lot easier to partner with people that want to help people. And so actually it's not been my experience that we've had difficulty partnering with nations, because we speak a universal language of health and healing.
Interesting, we also speak English, which is the medical language of the world.
Oh, well, there you go. You mentioned before the success, the 90% success of, success rate for battlefield injuries. the problem or the thing that creates is this that you have survivors who have experienced great amounts of trauma and sometimes traumatic brain injury as well, that these are things that were not seen in previous conflicts because those people wouldn't have survived. And now they are surviving physically but are experiencing great psychological trauma and in some cases physical trauma in the brain. What innovations in delivery or particular technologies are you bringing to bear on those very specific challenges that are really unlike anything that we've seen before?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. You're right. We're routinely saving men and women who would have died in any previous conflict, and they come back home with their entire life ahead of them. And so innovations in prosthetic technology has been particularly invaluable for us. I'll give you an example of a young Marine who came home with double amputations above his knees. We outfitted him with 3 different sets of prosthetics. One was just general walking. One was for running because he and his dad were going to be on that TV show, The Great Race. And he was so fast that the other contestants complained.
Did he have the blades? Did he have those blade running things? Oh,
he did.
Yeah.
And I said,
forget it, you can't keep up.
If you want to go and sacrifice and serve for your country, you have a right to complain. Otherwise, not so much.
Right.
The third set we've made for him was to climb Mount Kilimanjaro.
No way.
To take the ashes of his buddy who had also been killed and put them on top of the mountain. That's the caliber of young men and women that are coming back home with their whole life ahead of them. And so we've done that. Traumatic brain injury, we've started to understand that more. And what goes on frequently in the minds of people is if it's inside the brain, it's a black box. But what we've found is we've done a great deal of research in tensor imaging and imaging of the brain so that when we have somebody with traumatic brain injury, we can image their brain and then show them where the neurons are disrupted. And then download that on their laptop so they can go home to grandma in Texas and say, hey grandma, here's where my brain is broken. And when you demystify the condition, compliance increases, morale, mood increases, and outcomes improve. So we've done that. And then the other area that we've worked very hard on is in post-traumatic stress. Because, previous generations, you came home and you didn't talk, and those generations suffered. And we've worked very hard to demystify that and make it okay to ask for help. When I visit hospitals, I frequently will go sit in the mental health clinic, not because I have an appointment, but just so that people see, hey, it's okay to ask for help. It's okay. If the Admiral's sitting there, waiting for what they think is a mental health appointment, it's okay for me to ask for help. We've worked very hard to demystify that. And then we looked at alternative therapies. So different things that perhaps we don't have the best scientific knowledge on, but somehow it works. And so we've invested in using those things. And that has
Which
helped.
therapies are you finding most intriguing?
Interestingly, we're looking at like acupuncture. We look at different recreational therapies, therapies that basically allow you to build something or have a sense of accomplishment, improves mood, which in turn improves outcome. And also getting people together just to talk about their experience. They never used to do that before. And that's a challenge for us, because at the end of World War II, when you got back on the boat, you had a ship ride across an ocean before you got home. You had an opportunity to process what you'd been through. Now you fly home. So you go one day in combat, the next day back with your families. You don't have an opportunity to process. And so we're looking at different ways to bring people together to talk about things using alternative therapies to be able to improve outcomes. And so we've got several studies going on right now to look at that.
So Dan, I think that represents, the brain represents the last medical frontier. And I think you're now seeing that both traumatic injury and also psychological injury. I mean, there's 20 veteran suicides a day going on in the United States now. And this is obvious, most of this is probably psychological as opposed to post-traumatic stress syndrome. And this is area that we're going to have to, we're saving their limbs, we're saving their lives, but obviously we've got a lot to learn about neurologic injury.
Inside that black box of the brain is the answers to addiction. And across the nation, especially in Ohio, we've seen a growing opioid epidemic that does not yet appear to be slowing down appreciably. the epidemic, some of the forces creating the epidemic have to do with the prescribing, the routine prescribing of opioid pain medications that then people can't afford, and then they go on heroin or whatever they can find, whatever street drugs will help them self-medicate. We've gotten better at talking about it as a disease, but I wonder, Admiral, starting with you, how has the Navy, and you guys are probably prescribing a whole ton of pain meds, right, to veterans. How has the Navy dealt with this?
So interestingly, we're actually not. If you look at this, we learned very early on from the wounded warrior population and experience the need to aggressively manage pain. And so we have basically established systems that we put in place to be able to do that. So for example, most pain management will occur at the primary care level. Many primary care providers don't have expertise in pain management. So very early on we set up consultant teams on both coasts at our major medical centers so that on demand a primary care doc with a patient in his office can contact one of these pain consultants to get advice on how to manage pain. We've invested in alternative therapies, like I say, acupuncture and some of these other things. All of those get tried before we go to an opioid. So actually our use of opioids is below the general population. Our challenge has been drug-seeking behavior. Where we're blessed is that if a service member has written a prescription that DOD pays for, it's entered into a pharmacy database. And so we have a record of what meds people are on. And so what we do is every week at every one of our hospitals, we go in there and identify the local high utilizers of different medications that might be doing drug-seeking behavior. And we bring them in to our medical homes to do chronic pain management for them. So we've actually put these systems in place based on early experience with wounded warriors to try and get ahead of that bow wave to manage opioid therapy in a much more aggressive manner.
Have you seen that improve outcomes then, that you have fewer opioid abusers?
We do, absolutely, absolutely.
Part of what you said too in describing the pain management clinics on both coasts treats pain management as a separate sort of discipline, which not a lot of systems do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a separate discipline. We've taken some of our anesthesia providers and sent them to pain management fellowships, and they kind of lead these teams. But it's a multidisciplinary team. There's a pharmacist on that team, there are nurses on that team, there are social workers on that team, because pain is not just about pain, it's about taking care of the patient, and it's a much more holistic approach. And we found that paid good dividends for us.
Dr. Cosgrove, how similar or different is that from the way hospital systems in the United States are dealing with the same problems?
Well, Dan, I think you have to look at what's going on in this epidemic right now. There were 72,000 deaths last year in the United States. And it is, the one thing that is really causing the problem is the lacing of the heroin, if you will, with fentanyl and carfentanil. And as you know, people are now thinking that they're taking their standard dose and get something that is now 100 or 10,000 times more potent than morphine laced into their drugs. And this is really accounting for a lot of the deaths that we're seeing. Now, I have some hope right now for the first time that I've felt this about this epidemic. You see in the New England states now that the incidence is going down. And
Why is that?
Well, I think that they have been ahead of us in talking about the magnitude of the problem, the seriousness of it, and I'm delighted now that over the last couple of years we've begun to understand the magnitude of the problem. We've talked about it every place we can think about talking about it, and the physicians are prescribing less and less opiates along the way. So I hope that we've now seen a peak in this epidemic. But it's still present, and I don't know if you're aware or not, but one of the things that we did at the Cleveland Clinic is we did random drug testing across all of our employees. And if they test positive or something, we don't fire them, we put them in rehabilitation. This essentially is recognizing that we have treating this as a disease as opposed to something that is
criminal offense.
Criminal act.
Getting back though to the model that the Navy's using, is that how similar or different is that to the way the Cleveland Clinic operates with respect to pain management or tracking of pills and usage?
Well, the tracking of pills is now done across the state.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a number of things that we've done along these lines. The first one of the things we did is it used to be that pain was a measure on, the control of pain was one of the measures on how you get paid for Medicare. And
Through the Affordable Care Act.
The Affordable Care Act. And through a lot of positioning and a lot of work in Washington, we got it removed as one of the issues. We still measure it, but it's not related to the pay that we ultimately get.
Mm-hmm. That was one of those unintended consequences of the ACA.
Total unintended consequences of that. The other things that we have done is looked at things like back pain. We know that 80% of the people in the United States at one time or another in their life have back pain. And so we have developed a whole program now for physiotherapy and psychological therapy to avoid having to start them on some sort of pain medication. Mm-hmm. So there is increasing awareness amongst our physicians, decreasing use, monitoring of it, alternative ways to deal with pain.
Mm-hmm. It does sound, though, that there's a lot that the civilian hospital systems could learn from the way the Navy is at least tracking and identifying potential problems.
Well, in truth, the Navy does have one advantage over us.
Right. Yeah. You can order somebody to come in.
But you also, if they test positive, they're out of the service.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
We don't have that choice.
No, you can't fire the people who show up in the emergency room.
No.
But before we go, to questions from all of you, I just wanted to, Admiral, give you a chance to. This is Navy Week, so I'd like to give you a chance to kind of put in a plug for the Navy, or Cleveland, whichever you're enjoying more right now.
Well, actually both, to be honest. It's great to be home. I grew up in Rocky River and went to Rocky River High School, and it's great to be back in Cleveland again. It's great to be back in Cleveland as part of the Navy. And I just want to say thank you to the community. Cleveland is an amazing supporter of our military and our Navy in particular. And I want to say thank you for that. So thank you very much to you. We could not do our mission without community support, and the community support here in Cleveland is amazingly strong. As we look ahead, the opportunities for partnerships, for collaborative agreements to help us get ready for the future, the willingness, the support, all of the things that I've had the privilege of seeing in the short time that I've been here, and the folks that I've talked to just inspire me that Cleveland wants to help. Mm-hmm. And I just want to say thank you for that. So Navy Week is an opportunity for the Navy to come and tell you about your Navy and the things that we're doing on behalf of our nation. We're a maritime nation. Our economy, our way of life, our stability depends on freedom of the seas and security of the shipping lanes. 40% of your Navy is deployed today to protect our interests around the world. Every day there are 27,000 ships at sea bringing goods to the United States. And the Navy is out there on point with the Marine Corps to protect those ships and preserve our economy of way of life. And so this is an opportunity for us to tell you about the things that we do. For myself in Navy medicine, it's the things that we talked about. It's our research labs around the world. We have research labs in Thailand that are getting ready to start clinical trials on a vaccine for malaria. Malaria is the #1 infectious disease cause of death in the world. And we'll develop that to protect our service members. But think about the impact that could have globally if you take off the table the #1 cause of death from infectious disease. We have a team in Ghana right now developing the groundwork to begin to develop an Ebola vaccine. Another team doing the same thing for Zika. This is what your Navy's doing for you. And so it's an opportunity to come and educate you about, hey, this is what your tax dollars pay for. Peace, security, advances in medical practice, building on what Dr. Cosgrove said. The victors in war is medicine. And I think there'll be good benefits for that. So the Navy Week is an opportunity to share all that with you, but most importantly, to say thank you to an amazing community that supports us, perhaps more than any of us realize every single day. We could not do our mission without you. And I just want to say thank you for that.
Dan?
Yes, Dr. Cosgrove.
Yeah, the Admiral asked me if you'd now lead us in a chorus of Anchors Away.
We'll get to that right after the forum, right after. That's the inimitable humor of former president and CEO of the Cleveland Clinic, Dr. Toby Cosgrove, and with us as well as Vice Admiral C. Forrest Faison III, the U.S. Navy Surgeon General. I'm Dan Moulthrop with the City Club. We're about to begin the audience Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, and those of you joining us via our live webcast. If you'd like to tweet a question, you can tweet it at the City Club, and our team will work it into the program. We've got a couple of questions on this side, on the other side of the room, Bliss. If you are looking for a question, there are a couple over there. Holding our microphone is our content coordinator, Bliss Davis. We're ready for our first question.
First of all, gentlemen, thank you for being here, and we probably don't say it enough to both of you. Thank you for your service as well. A question on cross-training. We talk a lot about things that are shared. How often does the private sector, Dr. Cosgrove, cross-train with the Navy? Do you have Navy nurses or doctors do clinicals at the Cleveland Clinic, and vice versa, Admiral? Do you have Cleveland Clinic doctors and nurses in practice in some of that research you talked about going on around the world?
Sure.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Oh, sir. Absolutely. We do an incredible amount of cross-training with the civilian sector. So most of our research agreements are done in collaboration with major academic universities back here in the States. So for example, we are doing a research program right now that's 20 years in length looking at treatment of dengue fever in Peru. That's been done as a multi-institutional collaborative with major academic medical centers and universities back here in the United States. I send my corpsmen, the corpsmen on our team, 40% of the Navy medicine team are hospital corpsmen, many of whom have been out of high school less than 5 years. And they will be the #1 cause of combat survival. They'll be the #1 reason we save lives in any future conflict. We send them to civilian institutions to get a trauma experience that they could never get otherwise. So we do a lot of that going forward. At the same time, when those hospital ships go out to do these humanitarian assistance disaster relief missions, we always take academics, universities, students, medical students, even college students and college professors go with us, as well as governmental or non-governmental organizations and charitable organizations. So we very rarely go by ourselves anywhere, and we could not be ready for our mission without these collaborative partnerships with the civilian sector.
You know, and I would say that we look hard to try and recruit people who are coming out of the service. I think we've got over 500 people that we have recruited that come after their military experience, and we're very enthusiastic about hiring veterans, as many as we can get our hands on. With a few exceptions, they've been excellent.
Yeah.
Are you referring to yourself there? I'm sorry. Okay.
If I could just build on that just real quickly, this is a partnership I didn't talk about. These wounded warriors, the ones that have traumatic brain injury, one of the major symptoms that's left from that is short-term memory loss. You got to have short-term memory to get through college. So despite having very generous educational benefits, a large percentage of our wounded warriors fail out of college. Most of the technology is geared towards the Alzheimer's population. So we look to partner with civilian academic institutions to develop curricula that is geared towards people with short-term memory loss, and partner with industry to develop adaptive technologies to assist with this. To bring this home to Cleveland, this is exactly what I talked about with President Snyder at Case Western Reserve yesterday, and the faculty and the brand new president at Cleveland State. There's amazing opportunities here in Cleveland for partnerships, which are medically related, but not necessarily medical in nature.
One of the things that you saw after World War II was an explosion in healthcare capabilities across the United States. Interestingly, 30% of the doctors in the United States were in the military during World War II.
Yeah.
Next question.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being here in your service. We're looking to the future, what's on the horizon, and I see a lot of effects on health related to weather changes, climate change. So my question to either one of you, but perhaps starting with the Admiral, is what has the Navy learned about our oceans and the consequences of climate change on health, and how do you think we can work more cooperatively to address these future issues? Thank you.
That's a great question. Let me talk about conditions that set up risks to health as a result of climate change. What we're seeing now, if you look globally, is a shortage of water. And so if you look at population movements, there are mass migrations of populations to what we call megacities on the coastline because of crop failures, droughts, as a result of climate change. There are more displaced people today than there were at the end of World War II as a result of that. And so what you're seeing is the growth of the megacity on the coast. So you pick any of these cities, Shanghai, Rio de Janeiro, any of these, to cities that really don't have the infrastructure to support that population. That becomes a breeding ground and a risk area for disease and things like that. And so we're very focused on learning the impacts of climate change, but most importantly, what does that mean in terms of movements of population, and then from that health risk?
Anything to add, Dr. Cosgrove?
You know, I think it's very clear that you're seeing enormous changes in the oceans across the entire world, and not to mention debris that we're now seeing in the oceans, which from the plastics, and clearly the plastics are getting eaten by the fish, and the fish is getting eaten by people, and you know, there's clearly carcinogens associated with that. So I think we've got major issues that are arising right out of our oceans.
Are you seeing, just to follow up on that for a second, Dr. Faison, are you seeing with climate change has come an increase in severe weather patterns? You alluded earlier to the fact that 80% of natural disasters are happening in the Pacific Theater. So are you seeing just the demand on disaster relief, healthcare-related, disaster-related healthcare delivery to be like just climbing?
We are seeing that. We're seeing much more extreme weather than we've seen before. And again, we need to be ready to be able to respond to that. We need it, but we've responded to a variety of different, tsunamis and hurricanes and things like that. We are tending to see more. I don't know that I can put numbers to it, but I would definitely say that we're starting to see more of that.
Mm-hmm. Next question.
So I have a question. I just came from DC to a forum with the military leadership around obesity prevention, and I know it has a huge role in the military as not only for our men and women who are fighting on the battleground, but also with the military as a whole as the largest employer across the nation, with active duty, with reservists, with civilians, and then the families and dependents. What are you doing to address obesity in the military? Because I know it affects the recruitment and retention.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. So only 1 out of every 4 graduating high school seniors is eligible to come on active duty. So we're competing with top talent for that. And because of the sophistication and complexity of the systems that we use, our ships and things like that, training pipelines are longer. So the Navy will spend about $100,000 per sailor to get them from the recruiter to their first duty station because of those training pipelines. So we're very vested in keeping folks healthy. One of the big reasons that 3 out of 4 high school seniors are not eligible to come on active duty is because of obesity. We've seen the obesity epidemic in our country right now. The folks that want to join our military are not immune to that. So we work very hard when we get them on active duty during their initial recruit training to get them in shape. And so sailors are focused there. We have programs that we've put in place for our junior enlisted sailors that are coming on active duty to get them in shape and keep them in shape. And then we've worked very hard with we call them galleys, the kitchens, and dining halls at our recruit training and then our follow-on training to provide healthy alternatives. And that's a little bit of a culture change, especially in the Navy. We cherish what are called sliders. Sliders are hamburgers, and they're called sliders because they're greasy. And everybody likes their sliders, but those are not good for you. So we've worked very hard to provide healthy alternatives, educational, nutrition counseling. The other thing we've done is a lot of eating is stress related. And so we have taken mental health providers and embedded them into recruit training units and into the fleet to look for risk factors that could portend either overeating or other unhealthy behaviors, to intervene before it becomes a problem, to stay ahead of that.
So Dan, let me just weigh in on this one for a second. Excuse the pun. But
Weigh in. It's great. Go.
But this epidemic is exploding in the United States, and the seriousness of it, I think, was really brought home to me by a group that gathered recently this summer to talk about chronic diseases. And right now, 40% of the United States is overweight, is obese, and growing continuously. And if you trace it back, it winds up being associated with heart disease, cancer, orthopedic problems, diabetes, all of the chronic diseases. So at the end of the day, probably the most lethal thing that you have in your home is your fork. And it's what's on the end of your fork that really is making a huge difference in your health over a period of time.
That's why you picked up the cookie before with your fingers?
I did.
Yeah.
But I figured I got the omegas for the salmon.
Yeah,
so I was
exactly.
But you know, this is really an important issue that we have not begun to deal with, and it's part of the food chain in the United States. And until we begin to look at our food supply and what we put on the end of that fork, we are not going to be able to deal with this epidemic. And by the way, this is an epidemic that's going across the world.
Do you think we're making progress yet?
No.
No.
No, I don't. I don't think we're making progress. I mean, you made great progress. You look terrific.
Thank you. Thank you.
He's lost a lot of weight. He just told me about. But I don't think we're making progress, and I think the obesity issue is getting worse and worse, and we're seeing a juvenile obesity in kids, and just as you talked about, you know, you can only get 1 in 4 who qualify, and the major reason is because of obesity.
Yeah, obesity. I'm a pediatrician, and you know what we're starting to see is atherosclerotic plaques in the hearts of 2-year-olds who die for other reasons. In
Wait,
children,
what?
we're starting to see fatty plaques in the blood vessels of 2-year-olds.
What accounts for that?
Diet,
What are they eating?
bad stuff.
God.
Yeah. So it is, as Dr. Cosgrove said, it's a national epidemic, and it is a threat to health.
The 2 epidemics that we're dealing with right now in the United States are drugs and obesity. And we're not going to control the cost of healthcare in the United States until we begin to control those 2 things.
Thank you very much, both of you, for those answers. Another question?
Okay, this is going to be sounding a little bit anticlimactic after that great conversation. But one of the other areas of cost has been that we've been challenged with in the private sector is how do you get electronic health records to be interoperable? You know, really, truly connect. And I know we have the CEO of the VA here, sitting here, and we have experience with the VA and now with the Department of Defense that don't even talk to each other. What kind of leadership do you think is going on right now within government to try to set the tone and the stage for us to really be truly interoperable?
Yeah, well, you know, I don't know if you have noticed this or not, but about 2 weeks ago, the White House convened a group of people from Microsoft, Google, Amazon, IBM, PayPal, etc., all came together, and they agreed that they would have interoperability at the level of the cloud. And as electronic medical records and data gets increasingly stored in the cloud, you're then taking 1 step above the electronic medical records, which do not communicate. So I think our hope is to get that interoperability. It's going to happen at a higher level. Now you may say, well, why are people going to the cloud? And I think that's interesting now that the total amount of knowledge in healthcare is now doubling every 73 days. Yeah. And nobody can manage to keep track of all that data, and we're going to need cloud capabilities to do that. And if you stop and think about it, the advantage of putting it in the cloud also rolls over into the fact that you now have artificial intelligence and machine learning on that data that is coming out of the cloud that is going to be invaluable for understanding things that we never understood before and helping us be more specific and more personal.
As Dr. Cosgrove said, there will be a convergence to uniform standards, I think. There has to, because of the explosion in medical knowledge that is occurring. We're at a point where it will be impossible for the human brain to know everything necessary to care for patients. You've got to be able to drive decision support, and then, oh, by the way, standardize that healthcare to best practices. You've seen the Institute of Medicine report on preventable deaths every year because of variability in healthcare. That becomes a national imperative for us. The other reason that's important is to be able to do the big data analysis that Dr. Cosgrove was talking about. Because, as one example, because of the miracle of air travel, you can be anywhere in the world today well within the incubation period of a lethal infectious disease. And many of those show up as subtle vital sign changes or chief complaints. And so you've got to be able to do real-time data analysis to identify emerging health threats. And that's an imperative for us to keep the force healthy, but we're also partnering with others. So I think what you're going to see is these stovepipe, non-communicating systems really are going to have to merge and converge into standards, either in the cloud or some other way, because that will become a national imperative for all the reasons I just talked about.
Let me just go back for a second and just give you some examples of how big the data is. There are now 5,600 medical journals putting out over 800,000 articles a year. You know, I don't think anybody can keep up with that amount of data. And then you stop and think about, just take a mammogram. There's more information in a single mammogram than there is in the New York phone book. To take what's happening with the human genome, there are 3 billion base pairs in every human genome. Now, we got to have a different way to store that amount of data, and this is all going to be part of what is going to be your treatment going forward, and we've got to have access to it. It's got to be categorized, and we've got to analyze it.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, first off, I want to say thanks again for your service and for all the current and former members of the service in the room. Thanks for your service as well. I now currently work in domestic healthcare, but have had a 20-year career in international public health. So I was really excited to hear you talk a little bit about the Zika and malaria and other research that you're doing. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. I personally was helping support the U.S. HIV research in Thailand, which happened. It was a big breakthrough, the RV-144 trials, and the current work that's going on in that as well. But if you could talk any more about the Zika, malaria, or any other interesting, more long-term projects that the Navy's working on, I'd love to hear about those.
Sure, absolutely. So we have research labs all over the world that are looking at cures and prevention, again, to protect the force, not only for the threats of today, but for the threats of tomorrow. And so, for example, our lab in Peru is doing the 20-year research on dengue, not only to develop a vaccine, but environmental controls. They also are doing some research in phages. As you know, with the emergence of pan-resistant bacteria, then we have to look at phages, which are viral particles, to be able to attack bacteria that are super resistant to any antibiotics. As an example how this played out, there was a gentleman who was in Mexico, no connection to the military, that developed a super infection with a bacteria that was resistant to all antibiotics, that was brought to San Diego in a coma and was unresponsive. So our lab in Peru got a call and said, hey, could you develop a phage cocktail to administer to this patient as kind of a Hail Mary last effort to try and save this guy's life. He's got kids and a family, and we did. And it was administered under a special exemption from the FDA, and that man woke up and made a full recovery. And went home with his family. So we're developing some of those things to look at areas of high threat for our military forces, but they've got amazing civilian application. The trials that we're doing up in the jungles of northern Thailand are looking at chloroquine-resistant malaria, falciparum malaria. That's what kills people. And so those clinical trials will go on ultimately resulting in a vaccine that, again, will make available. And you can imagine the global impact that could have on some developing nations when we can take off number one, a major cause of morbidity and mortality. A variety of different things. We have a lab that up until recently was in Egypt looking at fresh water. You know, as we have these mass migrations of populations, like, you've got to have fresh water to avoid disease outbreaks. Well, how do you do that on a scalable way to be able to avoid disease outbreaks? So we've got teams that are doing that. A variety of teams around the world. Every one of these, we partner with civilian academic institutions to be able to do technology trade-offs and handoffs to get those things into production. So if that helps.
Yeah, and I might just say the DoD funds very generously academic medical centers across the United States and research projects.
One of the exciting areas that we're focusing on is the Institute of Regenerative Medicine, the Armed Forces Institute of Regenerative Medicine, which is a collaborative of several academic institutions looking at regenerative medicine. So if you're an amputee, why can't we just regrow a body part for you instead of a prosthetic? And so we're doing a lot of research in that in partnership with major academic centers. It is a true close partnership. So thanks.
I want to hear more about that. Growing a new arm. Yeah. Do we have another question? Or no, we're wrapping? All right. Well, no, we're out of time. Today, before we finish, let me just say, as you're looking ahead to retirement, nothing goes quite with retirement like Rocky River. You know what I mean? All right. Today at the City Club, we've been enjoying a forum with Vice Admiral Forrest Faison III, the U.S. Navy Surgeon General, and Dr. Toby Cosgrove, veteran and former president and CEO of Cleveland Clinic. Our forum today is part of our Healthcare Innovation Series sponsored by the Cleveland Clinic and Medical Mutual. We have representatives from both organizations with us today, and we appreciate your continued support of City Club programming. Thank you very much. We also welcome guests at tables hosted by the Cleveland Clinic Learner Research Institute, Cuyahoga Community College, also known as Tri-C, and Logicalis. We thank all of you for being with us today. That brings us to the end of our forum. Thank you, Vice Admiral. Thank you, Dr. Cosgrove. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your participation. Our forum is adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland Incorporated.